Hello and welcome to History. I'm your host Charlotte, and on today's program we'll be discussing Al Sieber. If you want to learn more about Al Sieber, you can read this book like I did, Al Sieber, Chief of Scouts, by Dan L. Frapp. Al Sieber was born Albert Sieber in Mingolsheim, Baden on the 27th day of February, 1843. After the death of his father in the Baden Revolution, his mother would emigrate with her surviving 8 children to the United States. Al would first grow up in Pennsylvania, then Minnesota. As a young man of 18, Al Sieber joined the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry during the Civil War. He fought in the battles of Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. He was seriously wounded in the Battle of Gettysburg in the 2nd day of the engagement. After the war, he headed west like many men, and as was common, took up prospecting in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Here, Al Sieber describes a Sunday in the life of a prospector. Even beyond the fringe of civilization, Sunday is a day of rest, or at least for not pursuing one's normal labors. Prospectors and hunters, if they could remember which day Sunday was, used it for washing clothes, repairing tools, lolling around camp, hunting, or some other pursuit less backbreaking than working a rocker, although from sheer boredom they usually ended up with it by mid-afternoon. Page 148. Sieber eventually made his way to Prescott, Arizona, the state's one-time capital. While working on a ranch, he became well known for his scouting skills. In 1871, he was hired by General George Crook to be his chief of scouts. Sieber was involved in much of Crook's Tonto campaign from 1871 to 1873. Here's an excerpt from the book detailing many a man's state of mind during this time. The troops under Major Chaffee and a company of scouts under Al Sieber arrived at the valley and encamped at Sigsbee's. The bodies of the murdered men were found horribly mutilated by the Indians and were decently interred. It was an all too common incident in the long decades of Indian war in Arizona. Men had become hardened to such scenes and no one thought much about it. There was no particular desire for revenge, a luxury emotion for non-combatants in faraway Tucson and other safe places. Page 248. And here another clip describing Sieber on the trail. Sieber sometimes led his scouts in side expeditions which might last a few hours, a day, a week, or several weeks, and on one of these an Apache was captured, even though the order had been to take no prisoners. Sieber wanted to get information out of this Indian, however, and kept him around for several days, despite the hole which his insatiable appetite made in the party's rations. At length they turned back toward the main column. As Al told a friend, he realized that he couldn't bring in a prisoner after he had been ordered not to do so. Morning came and the Indian scouts, the prisoner, a packer, and Sieber were sitting in a circle eating their sparse breakfast. Al figured there was no time like the present. "I motioned to some of my scouts," he said, "and they did not seem to understand, or didn't want to understand. So I took my rifle, laid it back of the packer's head, and shot the Indian behind the ear just as he was biting into a piece of bread. He fell over backwards, his feet went up into the air, and the packer turned to me and said, 'Al, if I had known you was going to do that to him, I would not have let him eat so much.'" Page 142. Al Sieber was also hired to move Tonto Apaches and Yavapais to the San Carlos Reservation when the Camp Verde Reservation closed. Here's a selection from the author describing the reservation's closure. Now the situation at Camp Verde had been stirred up by persistent rumors, which had even reached the Indians, that this reservation, which the government had promised them forever, would be nothing of the sort. Pressure for white ownership of the lands allotted to the Indians was increasing. It was a frontier truism that white pressure, once generated, would always be eased at the expense of the Indians. So it was to prove again. Page 155. The transfer from Camp Verde to San Carlos would prove to be tragic. In the dead of winter, people of all ages and conditions were marched south. Sieber is credited with what success the march managed to hold. Sieber spent much of his time in San Carlos County from this time on in 1875. In 1877, Al Sieber was crippled after he was shot in the foot from a crowd of restless onlookers on the San Carlos Reservation. Between the injury and his growing dissatisfaction with the treatment of Apaches, Al Sieber returned to prospecting late in 1890. During the construction of Roosevelt Dam, Al Sieber was put in charge of a work crew of Apache workers. While inspecting a large boulder, it broke free and rolled onto Al Sieber, killing him. His body was laid to rest in Globe, Arizona, with this grave marker. A monument was also erected on the site of his death to honor him. It is a matter of dispute as to whether his death was an accident or revenge by the Apaches. But to this day, you'll hear both praise and criticism for Sieber from Apaches and Anglos alike. On both his gravestone and monument marker can be found gifts and flowers from Anglos and Apaches.
Thank you for watching this program. I hope you enjoyed history. Good night.